This next chart is from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Economic Board, and it tells us what percentage of U.S. retail sales are now comprised of e-commerce. Now, during the dot-com era, it was still under 1%, so despite all the hype around e-commerce and the subsequent bust, that was a time when under 1% of all U.S. retail sales were e-commerce, so those high valuations for the time were entirely on an expectation of future growth. Now, they weren't wrong from a long-term perspective despite the boom and the bust, because this percentage continued to rise steadily and even in a slightly exponential rate. And then we get up to the pre-coronavirus pandemic era, where this number got up to 11.2% at the end of 2019. The pandemic and quarantine obviously made people more dependent on e-commerce because there was less visiting of stores, but not tremendously so, because 11.9 in Q1 of 2020 peaked at 16.5% by Q2, so only about 4.6% more. The remaining 83.5% was still in physical brick and mortar retail. And then as the pandemic abated, certain habits stayed and people stuck with e-commerce even when they didn't quite have to, simply because e-commerce accelerated in efficacy and utility because of the surprise excess demand that it received. And after this digestion period for the last couple of years, now this percentage is again trending up. And we see that it is where it would have been under this trend line even if the pandemic had not occurred at all. The end of 2019 was 11.2%. Q1 2023 is 15.1%. And this seems like a smooth line independent of the pandemic. Now, it's not exponential like some other technologies in that it will keep rising forever. This is ultimately a percentage of total retail sales. I believe it will get to 30 to 40% and then saturate and flatline, but that is still huge because that is a doubling or more from the levels that we see now. And that correlates to a tremendous disappearance of more brick and mortar retail stores and all the overhead costs associated with them, as well as the parking lot land. I often emphasize that because the United States devotes a huge amount of land to parking lots, which are very rarely utilized. The percentage of the time that parking spots are used in retail store parking lots relative to the amount of land area devoted to them, because you have to count the aisles between the parking spot rows as well, is just huge. Parking lots are acres and acres of land that are very minimally used in the 2020s. They were set up around a lot of mid-20th century assumptions around cars and suburbs and shopping, and zoning laws in the United States are quite wrong, as I speak about in other videos on this channel. But this rising number shows the durability of e-commerce and how e-commerce can spread to more and more types of retail products. And 15.1% is pretty substantial. We already have many strip malls and retail shopping centers that are half empty or where half of the storefronts are shuttered. And that means the parking lot is very underutilized. And that phenomenon will increase in the United States even more, particularly since the United States has such a lopsided zoning paradigm around retail relative to housing. Videos on this channel that describe this phenomenon in more detail are this one in the tag in the upper right hand corner, as well as this other tag where I discuss zoning regulations that are lopsided and have created a glut of retail land as well as office space land, while creating a shortage of housing supply in a few large cities in the United States, when the United States is a country where housing should not be expensive at all, even in the big cities, because it's one of the most thinly populated advanced economy countries in the world. But this is the e-commerce percentage chart, and yes, it's a US only chart. In some countries, e-commerce is a greater percentage of total sales than in the US. But in the US, the technological disruption properties are higher because so much land is tied up into the concept of physical retail shopping. And that is why the fact that this percentage is rising again after the digestion phase of this pandemic spike reveals what the true trend line really was. Thanks for watching.